Hi, this is Brandy Eckman with SnoKing Beekeepers. This is Beginner Beekeeper Session 6, and we are covering Chapter 10 and part of Chapter 9 today. Okay, so we started Chapter 10 last week, and we discussed exclusively Varroa mite, because Varroa mite is a scourge upon beekeepers. And Varroa mite is such a pervasive problem. Pretty much everybody has this problem, even if they have VSH hives, which, reminder, that stands for Varroa sensitive hygiene. Even if they are treatment free, like they still have mites. Everybody has mites. Um, and Varroa sensitive hygiene, I'm not sure if I defined that for you last week. What Varroa sensitive hygiene means, and what a lot of beekeeping treatments do, is they cause the bees to become extra hygienic, which means that they start grooming each other. And when they groom each other, they groom the mites off of each other. So that's kind of how oxalic acid works, is oxalic acid crystallizes on the bees and then causes the bees to groom each other. And while they're grooming each other, they groom the mites off of each other. So that's why you get that excessive mite drop when you've done oxalic acid vaporization. And Varroa sensitive hygiene bees are basically bees that are extra hygienic. So they are bees that are more likely to groom the mites off of each other than other bees. So diseases can be spread a lot of different ways. They can be spread by nukes and packages. They can be spread by drift or by bombing. I think we mentioned mite bombing last week, which is where somebody doesn't take good care of their hive. It becomes overwhelmed with mite. The bees are like, man, this sucks. And then they leave, and then they fly to somebody else's beehive and bring all those mites with them. So yeah, drift or bombing can happen. Infected equipment can happen with disease, robbing. And then the beekeeper can also spread disease with hive tools, clothing, etc. There are two types of diseases. One is brood and one is adult. Um, and basically what you want to do is you want to ID the problem, get a diagnosis, figure out what the cause is of it, and then you want to deal with treatment or prevention or a veterinary feed directive. Um, it's very wise if you think that your hives are infected with the disease to contact a more experienced local beekeeper. Even when I saw chalk brood in my hive, which is one of the diseases we're going to talk about, I verified that. I didn't immediately say, okay, it's chalk brood, I'm going to begin treatment now. I verified that it was indeed chalk brood that I was looking at before I decided on a treatment plan. Um, so this is going to give you a very basic description of what these diseases are and what to look for. It's not all inclusive, just because some of these diseases can have a lot of different things to look for, but it's the most prominent signs of them. So, brood diseases, we've got American foul brood, which in my opinion is probably the worst case scenario. Um, it is caused by a spore-producing bacteria. The spores can be in infected honey, which is fed to larvae by the nurse bees. This is one of the reasons we always say never feed your bees honey that wasn't from your hives, because you don't know where that honey could come from. Spores can be dormant up to 70 years, which is incredibly long time. So if you think that, you had honey that was infected and it's been a couple years and it's fine, it's not. Or if you had a hive that was impacted and you think it's been a couple of years, you think it's fine. It's not. Those spores can last a really long time, basically almost a human lifetime. The most common, and they are the most destructive of brood diseases. The testing for American foul brood, you test with a toothpick, a twig, or pine needles, and the dead brood will pull away in a brownish rope, and odor. So the really sad part about American foul brood, and part of the reason I consider it one of the worst case scenarios, is because there's no effective treatment for American foul brood. You can't treat with antibiotics. You can't treat with like medicines. You can't treat with vaporizations. You can't treat with essential oils. There is no effective treatment for it. And due to the extreme difficulty of killing the spores, it is recommended to burn all woodenware and foundation, and basically the entire hive itself. It's unfortunately a really tragic situation. Um, and WASBA does recommend treating the hives in infected areas with terramycin and sugar syrup, powdered sugar dust, or a patty. The problem is over 25% of American foul brood is resistant to terramycin, which is a huge problem. So you have to stop 2 weeks prior to the honey harvest as well. And terramycin and tylosin tartrate are recommended because it adds resistance to antibiotics, or adds to the resistance against antibiotics. The best way to prevent this is to replace your brood frames every 3 years. So you have brood frames now, most of you are first year beekeepers. A lot of people will write the year on their frames. on their brood frames, and make sure your brood frames stay as brood frames. Once they're brood frames, they cannot be honey frames, or they should not be used as honey frames. It's a bad practice. And write the year on it, 2025, and then when 2028 rolls around, scrape those frames down, re-wax them, and reuse them again. So the next one is European foul brood. I actually had a friend of mine who's a beekeeper who actually had this happen to her hive. She had 2 hives and it hit both of them. And it was a multi-year problem. European foul brood is not fun to deal with. Just because it's not American foul brood and you don't have to literally set your hives on fire to deal with it does not mean it's an easy thing to deal with. This one is caused by a bacteria. It has a really strong sour odor. A lot of people liken the scent to like a dirty gym socks. The larva will be dead, brown, and twisted in the bottom of the cell, so there's no ropey goo like there is with American foul brood. A spring treatment of terramycin as a preventative has the same problems of resistance, so it's not recommended. This is not something to be used. Terramycin is not something to be used preventatively because resistance is a problem. The best prevention is to maintain strong, healthy hives in a sunny, dry location with good airflow. And Italian bees do seem to be more resistant. Then there's chalk brood, which is caused by a fungus. Symptoms are dead larvae that first turn white and then turn black. They're also referred to as chalk brood mummies. You may see them being cleaned out of the hive or left at the entrance, and it usually clears itself up in the heat of the summer. Again, this is one of those things that's prevented by having a healthy hive and replacing the brood frames every 3 to 5 years. So some of the adult diseases are there's various viruses, and there's I think it's like something like 60 different viruses that can just be vectored by Varroa mite. So we don't go over every single virus. The biggest virus that I see most commonly, just from watching other beekeepers, is deformed wing virus, which is where their wings are deformed and they can't really fly. And this usually indicates a like overload of mites. And the solution is to treat for mites. And that's usually how it is for most viruses that are contracted with the mites. Like the solution is not to treat with like terramycin or any other treatment, but to treat with mite treatment and deal with the mite problem. And then as the generation cycles through, as the older bees die off, the new bees will be born healthy. Nosema is the bee equivalent of basically really bad diarrhea. If you look at a hive and see like the stripes of like the orange poop all over, orange excrement all over the front of the hive, that usually indicates nosema. Poison, we consider an adult disease. It does happen. It is tragic. But unfortunately, things like insecticide drift does happen, or people's neighbors will spray. And even I even saw a case a couple years ago where somebody's hives were intentionally sprayed by an angry neighbor. It does happen. It does suck. And unfortunately, there's not really anything you can do about it when it happens, other than if it's drift or something, you can try to move the hive or you can try to talk to property owners. It is something you can try to be proactive about if you do know that like the county or the city or your neighbors do spray. This is one of those things where I recommend, especially if it's your neighbors, take a jar of honey over and say, hey, I'm a beekeeper. I noticed you spray your dandelions. I'm just wondering if maybe you couldn't do that. Or maybe you could let me know if you're going to do that and I can shut up my hives for the day when you do. That would be really appreciated. Like, here's a jar of honey, makes for good neighbors. And it makes for more polite neighbors too, a lot of the times, and more conscientious neighbors. And it's possible that they will choose, knowing that there's a beehive next to them, they may choose to not spray. So yeah, and then colony collapse disorder. Colony collapse disorder we'll go into more detail later, but it's really complicated. And it's a variety of things that contribute to it. Dan has asked, how do you re-wax brood frames? So you melt down wax. One of the things is it doesn't necessarily have to be your wax. You can buy wax from like a Snohomish Beco or Dodont or Man Lake. You melt down wax and then you usually use like a paintbrush or a paint roller and then roll wax onto it, onto your foundation. And if you buy, depending on what foundation you buy, you may have to wax it yourself to begin with. So always be careful when you're buying foundation. I buy foundation that is advertised as being triple waxed, and I've never had a problem with that. So they dip it 3 times basically. But have had problems with other foundation. And as you probably recall, bees will not build on plastic. So what you need is that wax to allow the bees to build on top of it. And if they don't have that wax, they'll build around it, and you'll end up with a lot of really funky burr comb, which is kind of a nightmare to deal with. So American foul brood. So this is the most serious brood disease. It's caused by sporulating bacteria, Bacillus cereus, Bacillus anthracis, Bacillus thuringiensis. I'm sorry, I'm terrible at these. Clostridium botulinum and Clostridium tetani. Spores can be dormant up to 70 years, as I mentioned. They can be in infected honey, which is fed to larvae by nurse bees. The spores can be dormant up to 70 years. I've said that a couple times, sorry. It is the most destructive because you do have to burn your hive. So they do have, I mentioned terramycin earlier, but there's also tylosin, which is an antibiotic and a bacteriostatic feed additive that's used in veterinary medicine. The thing that sucks about it is you have to get a vet to prescribe it to you, which means you have to find a vet who is comfortable and aware and knowledgeable about beekeeping, which is really, really hard. Which is why generally it's just your hive is considered a complete loss. Like it tells you a little bit about the disease when the less radical method of containing the spread of the disease is just burning everything, and thoroughly scorching the interior of the hive, the bottom boards, the covers. Dipping the hive parts in hot paraffin wax or 3% sodium hydrochlorite solution, which is also bleach, can also render the AFB spores innocuous. It is also possible to sterilize the infected hive without damaging either the structure or the stores in the honey, pollen, stores of honey and pollen that it contains by sufficiently lengthy exposure to ethylene oxide gas in an enclosed chamber. And you may think, well, that doesn't sound too bad, but the problem is these treatments are insanely expensive, and generally speaking, just not worth it. They cost more than it is to buy new gear and buy a nuke. What is the chance of spreading AFB from wax foundation or pre-wax foundation? Basically none. Basically none. The wax like gets heated when you render it. And some places actually do go through like a sterilization process with it. And especially if you buy from like a reputable source, like they're not going to have AFB in their wax. I've never heard of anybody getting it from pre-wax foundation. Unfortunately, what I have heard of spreading it is contaminated tools. So a beekeeper goes to their hives, they work their hives, excuse me, they have their hive tools, and then they go to another hive and then they work it with those same hive tools without having sanitized it, which is why if you ever go to another beekeeper's hive, do not bring your own tools. Because you don't know, and the beekeeper who runs that apiary doesn't know what is in your hive. And obviously, you know that you take care of your hive and everything, but it's just like, it's kind of like tracking mud into somebody else's house a little bit. It's just kind of considered a little bit rude. And there is obviously the chance of spreading something like AFB or EFB, or nosema, can be spread that way, things like that. So, but the chance of spreading AFB from waxing foundation or pre-wax foundation is basically none. So I wouldn't worry about that. So yeah, in Washington State, you burn the equipment and the bees. The last time I heard about AFB was, I want to say 3 years ago, and it was a hive in Seattle. And the guy had 2 hives. One of the hives was confirmed to be infected, and he burned both hives, which was unfortunate. I think he got some equipment or some bees donated to him from someone after it. But anyways, pretty tragic situation. In California, you can treat with antibiotics, but the sporulation does limit the antibiotic effectiveness, which is why we don't recommend it in Washington. The larva does die capped, so the cappings kind of sink in, like you can see in this picture here, and then it has that like gym sock smell, kind of like I mentioned. EFB can have kind of a sour, pungent smell. It's From what I've heard, it's a very distinct scent. You open up your hives and your stomach drops because you know what's going on. But that gym sock smell is not a good sign. European foul brood, also caused by bacteria, strong sour odor, not to be confused with a fermented odor. Fermented odors generally means that there's honey that's fermented in the hive, which is very common if you use frames from a previous year, that there may be some honey that fermented in there. So it'll have kind of almost a boozy kind of smell, like a musty, boozy kind of smell. Not the same thing as the scent of European foul brood. The larva will be dead, and it will be brown and kind of twisted and dry, kind of like these guys here. You can see they're kind of like crushed up. And you can see these guys are like drying out here. And here it's like kind of sludgy in the cell. They'll have an uneven discoloration, like these guys are yellowing here. It'll be twisted and there's no short rope. So if you stick a toothpick or something into the cell and pull it out, there will be no roping. There will be nothing pulling between the toothpick and the cell. The best prevention is to maintain strong, healthy hives in a sunny, dry location with good airflow. And like I mentioned, Italian bees do seem to be more resistant. It does seem to be caused by nutritional stress, which is one of the many reasons that I highly recommend feeding your bees. I mentioned in my email, but I even saw even more instances of people's hives starving over the last week, where people just thought, oh, blackberry's close enough, I don't have to feed my bees, or they did start feeding, where they fed them for a little while and then stopped. And now their bees, at least 2 hives I've seen, have died from starvation. And that's, obviously that's kind of the worst case scenario for this, as far as like nutritional stress goes. EFB obviously isn't great, but it is treatable. So it can be caused by poor forage, like no pollination crops out there, or it can be caused by inclement weather decreasing foraging, which is why I talked about a couple weeks ago when we had that like streak of rainy weather, that it was even more important to feed your bees, because your bees can't get out to forage and they need that food. So a fed hive is a healthy hive. So brood diseases, treatments, and prevention. There are unfortunately limited treatment options. The good news is most brood diseases do self-resolve with a weather change or the nectar flow resuming or you feeding them. Don't treat or ID or diagnose without an experienced beekeeper's help. And this is one of those things where like I highly recommend you reach out to me, you reach out to Eli, you reach out to somebody in the SnoKing Beekeepers group like Ron, who has been beekeeping for a few years and has seen these diseases, has gone through at least like journeyman training, and knows what these things look like. Because some of them can look like each other. Like obviously 2 foul broods can be confusing. Sometimes new beekeepers also get it confused. Like they see nosema and they think, oh, like there's discoloration on my hive. Like maybe that's European foul brood. So yeah, always talk to an experienced beekeeper if you do think that your hives have some sort of disease, especially if it's a brood disease. Best management practices, also known as BMP, is feeding your hive. Good nutrition is the most common treatment and the most common preventative. And this is part of the reason we spend an entire chapter talking about it, and I talk about it every single time we have a session. I know it's probably getting old at this point, but feed your bees. Your bees need it, and if you don't, then sometimes this can be the kind of penalty for that. And if that happens, then you have to deal with it. If you are going to medicate, you do need a veterinary feed direction. BF feed drugs must prominently and conspicuously display the following cautionary statement, which says that caution, federal law restricts the medicated feed containing this veterinary feed directive or VFD drug to use or be used by the order of a licensed veterinarian. OTC drugs do not have this statement and are therefore not valid to use on hives. And again, like I said, getting a VFD drug is very difficult. You have to find a vet who is comfortable and is also going to trust your judgment too, like because they're probably not going to come out to your hive and be like, oh, yep, you have European foul brood, sure enough, because they're probably not a beekeeper. So you have to find a vet who's going to trust your diagnosis or your reinforced diagnosis, and who is knowledgeable and comfortable prescribing those drugs to you. And then requeening can also be a good thing. So that's what I did with my chalk brood hive, is I pinched the queen and requeened it with a different queen. And I requeened it from a genetic line that is more resistant to chalk brood. And chalk brood, here we are. So it is fungal. So symptoms are dead larvae that first turn white and then black. It is very, very distinct if you look at it. The white debris is very, very obvious, although it can be old pollen pellets cleaned out of last year's comb. But having personally seen chalk brood in person now, I can tell you chalk brood is much larger than the old pollen pellets. So the dead larvae turn white and then black. They may be left at the hive entrance. You may also see them on the bottom board and on the bottom of the hive themselves as they clean it out of the brood. And it usually clears itself up in the heat of the summer. As we discussed when we talked about my hive suffering it, you can also requeen with a more resistant genetic variety. That's definitely an option. But generally, it's one of those things where you just kind of have to let it clear up and feed your bees. Sac brood. So sac brood is pretty distinct. It's a fluid-filled sac with a black head. Looks like this, kind of gross looking. And it has distinct uneven discoloration. Sac brood is not terribly common. I can't think of any instance in the last 6 years that I've been beekeeping where I've seen sac brood happen. So it's just not very common, but definitely something to be aware about just in case you ever see it. Chilled brood. So chilled brood is not a disease, but it is something that affects brood, and the brood dies because it gets too cold. This can be caused by a sudden drop in the temp in spring when the brood nest can't be warmed because there's too few adult bees. It is usually, unfortunately, caused by beekeepers themselves, who are opening the hive when the temp is below 50 degrees. Something to note is that it may replicate the symptoms of foul brood due to the odor of decaying brood. But I do think I have seen chilled brood before in person, and I do think it does smell a little bit different than foul brood. It doesn't quite have the same sour smell. It definitely has more of a moldy, musty smell to it. So these are dead bees. You can see how these cells have sunk there. So that's an indication of chilled brood. And then we've got some dead bees on the frame there. And yeah, it may have that decaying brood odor. Sometimes splitting the brood nest before summer can cause it, or splitting the brood nest too late in the winter can cause it, because then, or like having a late swarm can cause it, because then you have too few bees to cluster around the brood and keep the brood warm. So that is one of those things you want to be aware of when you are splitting your hive, is what time of year you're doing it. So cappings, these are some of the variation of capping. So like American foul brood, this looks like European foul brood here. This is like what healthy cappings should look like. So keep that in mind, like that it's got this kind of vibrant, like almost Dijon mustard yellowy color. It can be a little bit darker too, depending on the hive, depending on the genetics, depending on the wax, depending on the environment. But it shouldn't be like a very dark. The cappings should not be very dark. The comb itself may be dark because the bees are like walking on it and getting a bunch of junk all over it. But the cappings themselves should not be dark. So, best management practices. Remove dead, dying, or ill bees. Discard your worst looking frames of brood. Do not feed contaminated honey to bees. EFB and nosema can overwinter on frames and in honey. So if you do have like an infected hive with like EFB or nosema or AFB or something like that, all those honey frames are shot, unfortunately. You're gonna have to scrape them. And that sucks. And in that case too, I would scrape them directly into the trash. I wouldn't scrape them into like the compost or anything, because a lot of those spores can last a really long time. And this is also part of the reason we freeze honey too, is to kill off some of these things. So we talked about this a couple times about why you freeze honey like over the winter. Part of it is to keep wax moth out, which is very pervasive. But part of it is also to kill off any like bacteria or fungus that may be hanging around in the honey. But again, AFB cannot be killed off by if you have AFB in your honey, it's gonna get set on fire with everything else because it will not die if you freeze it. Sanitizing equipment is always a good idea. So scraping wax and debris off first. The scales can be left in cells. And then bleach or lye, and use like a diluted bleach solution to clean your tools. I honestly just run my tools through the dishwasher with a sanitize cycle on it. That's something I do almost every time I use them. And again, I don't share tools. Not in the sense that I don't share them with my beekeeping partner, but in the sense that I don't share them with other people's hives. So if I were to come and hang out at your hive, I would absolutely not bring my tools. If you needed me to bring tools, I would bring brand new tools. Just because I would never, ever forgive myself if I contaminated your hive with something that my hive had. Brood break can also be a option. So that can be done by requeening, or it can be done by splitting the hive depending on what time of year and what the capacity of the hive is in. Optimize ventilation and moisture control. This one is kind of one of those iffy ones in the sense that bees generally handle ventilation and moisture control very well as long as they aren't in poor conditions. And what that means is as long as they aren't, as long as you have like a metal roof on your hive, right? And there's not like wood that the water is like soaking through in the rain. As long as they aren't in boxes that are completely falling apart. As long as they are in places with the appropriate amount of like openings and the appropriately used entrance reducer. Bees will propolize where ventilation is that they don't want. And like seal up all the little cracks. You'll notice as you get towards fall and winter that more and more propolis will be in your hive because the bees are sealing everything up for winter. So as far as the ventilation and moisture control, and especially somebody asked about Apame hives, which I have, which are the plastic insulated hives. And they have vents in the roof. And 100% of the time I have found, and I have seen other beekeepers attest to the fact that the bees will close them. Even though it seems like it's good ventilation, this is one of those human designed things that just doesn't work for the bees. And so the bees will close it up. So when it says optimize ventilation and moisture control, really what I'd be considerate of is like how moisture is accumulating in the hive. So make sure your hive is tipped forward so that moisture can roll out the front, just by like an inch, that's tipped up at the back, or like shimmied up at the back. And make sure that your boxes are in good condition, replace them if they're not. Make sure that your roof has metal on it or is like a steeped roof, preferably both. Or if you have like a hutch like I do, to keep the moisture off the hive. And also controlling wind control too. Like we've talked about this a couple times, but having like good wind breaks so there's not wind just straight blowing through the hive because that will cause them to propolize more, and possibly beyond what is actually good for them. Boosting nutrition. Obviously, I'm going to harp on this all the time, which is just feed your bees. And make sure you're feeding them both seasonally appropriate pollen patties and seasonally appropriate syrup. And then decrease any other stresses. And you may say, like, that's kind of a broad statement. And what this means is, like, if your hives are being harassed by a raccoon, for example, you need to figure out a way to deal with that. Maybe you raise your hive stand. If your hives are being harassed by a bear, which is way worse, ask me how I know, it means it's time to set up a hot wire or electric fence. And these being harassed by a raccoon or like a possum or something is actually quite common, even around here, because it's a good source of food for them. And so they'll come in and they'll stick their little grabby hands in, and they may shake the box a little bit and try to get in, and it can stress the hives. Yeah, other stressors are things like moisture in the hive. So like making sure water isn't like seeping into the hive and any moisture that is accumulating in the hive can roll out the front. Those are the kind of stresses we talk about. So overall, just good cultural practices are the only effective and readily available treatment. So Nosema is also known as Microsporidium. There are two types of Nosema, and this is like the most common disease that we see. Nosema ceranae can affect a hive at any time of the year. Nosema apis is most problematic in winter and spring. And I think Nosema apis is honestly probably the more common of the two Nosemas, at least around here. It's caused by a single cell fungus. The spores must be ingested by the bee in order to infect the bee so that newly emerged bees are not actually infected. Once it's inside of the gut of the bee, its cell grows and bursts, releasing 30 to 50,000 spores, which bees have, teeny tiny little stomachs. So you can just imagine how uncomfortable that probably is. It's most pronounced in northern climates due to reduced flying time outside the hive. So like I said, Nosema apis, probably more common here. And Nosema is fairly common here. It usually clears itself up. The diagnosis is dependent on a microscopic examination of the gut content. Dissection frequently shows a whitish swollen stomach. It's usually really evident in our area, and it's usually evident in spring. The bees do not defecate in the hive unless there's a problem. So if you're seeing defecation inside or outside or like directly on the hive front, like this here, this actually isn't even the best picture I've seen of it. A lot of times it'll be like kind of a dark, like a dark orangish color. But it'll be all over the front. I mean, just covering the front if Nosema is present. You'll see it on the outside of the hive as they take their cleansing flights because they literally just can't hold it in. Lots of it'll be on the hive or inside the hive. There is Fumigil B, which is available again. It's not a VFD, so it is available over the counter. I keep some in my stores. I've never had to use it. I've had nosema once, and it cleared itself up actually pretty quickly as the weather changed. So some treatments are you can add essential oils to sugar syrup. So like a gallon of sugar syrup with a half of a teaspoon of thyme, a teaspoon of lemongrass, a teaspoon of peppermint, and a teaspoon of sweet orange oil. And then you can feed the infected colonies with it. Or more reliably, a gallon of sugar syrup containing Fumigil B in March or April before the nectar flow. Fall feeding may reduce nosema and wintering bees, partially because it gives them better nutrition as they're going into the winter. So you can have fatter, healthier winter bees. Some beekeepers do preventative treatments in the fall and spring, but that's usually not necessary, and preventative treatments aren't recommended. Poison. So this is a classic case of poison here, where you just have a heaping pile of dead bees outside the hive. This is one of those things that the best way to prevent it is to talk to your neighbors and be aware of what your county, city, HOA is doing. Bring a jar of honey, even if it's not yours. Go to like a local bee company and buy a few jars of honey, and just take it to your neighbors and say, hey, I just want to let you know I have beehives. If you do spray like your lawn or anything, can you let me know in advance so I can close up my hives? And that is something you can do, is you can close up your hives with like painter's tape or duct tape or like stuffed cloth in the opening. Excuse me. And close up your hives for like a day or two while the spraying is happening. And as long as your hives are being fed in the hive, then they'll be fine for that time. So good communication is the best way to prevent poison. And just being aware, like I said, King County, for example, does spray for certain like moths and stuff throughout usually the spring, summer, and fall. So that's something to be aware of. They'll usually notify you if they're spraying in your area, but because bees fly anywhere from 5 to 7 miles, it is helpful to be aware of if there is spraying going on in your area, because you may not be close enough to be notified, but you may be close enough for your bees to get poisoned. But I should say that is, I just want to warn people, because people have hives die and they really like to assume that it's either moisture or poison for some reason. And that is not common. Poison is not like a super, like nosema or mite induced issues are way, way, way more common than like poisoning of a hive. So colony collapse disorder, we still don't entirely know what causes colony collapse disorder, and there is, I don't know if anybody's seen the numbers from 2024, the 2024 beekeeping season, but there was a loss of about 50% of hives across the US, which is just kind of a crazy percentage. Like try and imagine if you were a rancher and you lost 50% of your stock. Just really, really bad. And so there's kind of this not necessarily a rumor going on, but there's some suspicion, I should say, that colony collapse disorder is resurging again. We don't know that it is, but that's just kind of been the talk because of what happened last season and because of how much loss there is. Obviously, a lot of this loss is in commercial beekeepers. Just keep that in mind. And colony collapse disorder primarily affected commercial beekeepers. But we do have some suspected costs. Oh, and colony collapse disorder is when a majority of the workers in a colony disappear and they leave behind plenty of food. They leave behind the queen, brood, and a few nurse bees to care for them. So you just open up your hive and there's just a handful of bees and a queen one day. So some of the suspected factors and causes are genetics, viruses, management issues, a crowded apiary, environmental stressors, pesticides like neonicotinoids, Nosema ceranae. And so far, it's a lot of correlation, but not causation, which is why people kind of describe it as like the historic, like the perfect storm. Again, it is more of like kind of a thing that has occurred historically, but it is something to be aware of, especially if it is resurging in at least commercial beekeepers. Integrated pest management, if you're a gardener, you're familiar with this term, also known as IPM. Integrated pest management is when you basically treat your hives in a way that integrates pest management into it. And this is a lot of kind of what we've talked about in like a holistic fashion. the important reason to have IPM is the cost. It's safer for the bees, it's safer for the environment, it's safer for the beekeepers, and it reduces the development of resistance. So IPM is important. So IPM is like, for example, so I'm treating my bees with Apogard right now. This is what I do in spring is I treat my bees with Apogard. And then it starts to warm up, my bees get supers on them, and I treat my bees with formic acid. This is what I do. And then when fall rolls around, I treat my bees with oxalic acid vaporization, basically until it gets too cold to do so. So that is my integrated pest management plan. Um, it is good to have a plan, to know what you're doing, and like since Varroa mite is the biggest pest that we have, it is best to plan against Varroa mite. It's not necessarily like useful to have a plan against like American foul brood because American foul brood is still pretty rare, even though it's quote unquote common for foul broods. But having an integrated pest management plan against like Varroa mite is just a smart move for beekeepers. It also keeps you from doing things like wasting treatments, or like having treatments expire, or over treating a hive or under treating a hive, things like that. So pests. So we got wax moths. Wax moths are exactly what they sound like. They eat your wax. They show up generally in the winter. A strong hive can generally combat wax moth. But it's something that mostly I see attacks people's like empty frames. So they'll like store their empty frames in like a shed or a garage and not in like an airtight container or in a freezer. And then the wax moth will come and they'll eat all that wax. They're actually eating the pollen that's in the wax. They'll eat all that wax, they'll eat all that pollen that's in there, and then they'll reproduce. And it's disgusting. Wax moth is super gross. I had it happen once and never again. Mice can also be a problem. I've seen a hive where a mouse built a nest at the bottom of the hive and the bees were just kind of letting it live. And that's super fun to have to evict. Ants can be an issue, although generally a strong hive will take care of ants that get in the hive. But you may see ants around the hive, and that's less of a big deal. If the ants are in the hive, and like significantly in the hive, then that can be a problem. Earwigs and crab spiders can be an issue, but these are generally dealt with pretty simply and easily. Small hive beetle is super rare in this area. The only instances that I've heard of it happening is when people get nukes from like California and then they open up the nuke and there's small hive beetle in the nuke. And then like they just squish all the small hive beetles and all the larvae, and then it's fine because small hive beetle can't really survive in this environment anyways, at least not right now, although with how things are going weather-wise, that may change. Wasps, yellow jackets, and hornets, so they can predate a hive. Same with skunks, raccoons, badgers, and bears. And then obviously Varroa mite is pest number one. So mice, that is why we recommend a mouse guard before the freezing weather. And this is an example of a mouse guard here. So you can see absolutely no way for a mouse to get into here. But the bees can obviously get in and out, no problem. And this is something you install like, in like September-ish. So you don't want to have, some people do have them on all year long, but you don't necessarily want to have them on all year long. Mice do damage a hive. Not only do they build nests and raise their young, but they can also eat the wax in stores. And like I said, best prevention is an entrance reducer or mouse guard in the fall. Ants. So ants can overcome a weak hive. The best measure is to locate a hive away from any established ant nest. And obviously, if you do find an established ant nest, to take care of it. Natural methods of defense do include petroleum jelly on the base or legs, wood ashes, diatomaceous earth. If you do use diatomaceous earth, be very careful that you aren't getting it on your hive because it will kill bees as well. Cinnamon and red pepper can also work. And these will work if the ant nest isn't already really well established and hasn't necessarily found the hive. It can be used as a deterrent. If it has like been a problem in the hive, then you may need to use like an ant or termite bait such as fipronil buried inside the ant nest. Earwigs, crab spider, and small hive beetle. So we got earwigs here. They're disgusting. Crab spiders, they're pretty common around here. And they will predate bees, but I've never seen one on a hive. And then small hive beetle here. Earwigs are usually not looked upon with any degree of tolerance, but they can live in a hive, usually in a small enough numbers to not cause any problem. When I worked with 21 Acres Beekeeping, they had a problem with with termites or earwigs getting into their bottom boards because they used like corrugated plastic as their bottom boards. So they would stuff diatomaceous earth inside the like slots of the plastic. And then they would also dust the lid with diatomaceous earth as well. So that's the only time I've seen anybody actually treat for earwigs and where earwigs have actually been like an actual problem. Small hive beetle, again, like I said, not really reported as a problem in Washington State. They do feed off the pollen on solid bottom boards, so you want to use screen bottom boards. The larvae do burrow into the ground under the hive. Their treatments are like to relocate the hive. Some people also use Swiffer pads in the bottom board, like if you have a screen bottom board, and that like traps and kills the hive beetles. And then obviously freezing temperatures, which is part of the reason hive beetles really don't survive up here, is because we tend to have at least 1 or 2 good hard freezes during the winter. Some other honeybee predators, dragonflies are carnivorous, as are mantises. I wouldn't call them problems per se, but if you see them with a honeybee, it's the circle of life. It's nature being nature. Some vespid honeybee predators are the wasps, hornets, and yellow jackets. So some identifications for them is they have narrow wings that fold longitudinally when at rest. Their larva is reared on insect prey, so on like bees. They have these segmented bodies that are similar to bees, but they're completely hairless. They make nests of wood fibers, and some of them nest in the ground. They will sting repeatedly, unlike honeybees, and only the mated queen overwinters. So if you do find a nest and you can't take care of it, it will die off during winter. They are known as decent pollinators and do control agriculturally damaging insects, so they can be beneficial to gardeners like cabbage loppers and things like that. But generally, a lot of beekeepers, especially beekeepers with a number of hives, will start trapping for them during like probably about like 2 months ago. They would have put out traps for the queens as the queens started to emerge. Paper wasps. So this is what paper wasps look like. Again, they're one of the vespids built out of wood fiber. Usually, if these nests are small like this size here, you can just knock them down and they'll get discouraged and go away. You can put up decoys that look like the nests because they generally won't build within like about 200 feet of another nest. So you can put up a decoy if you're concerned about it. We put them up around our deck because I don't want them building under our deck. And generally that will keep them away. Bald-faced hornets. These are nasty guys. They're larger than a yellow jacket and they're black and white with different facial markings. So you can see there's a bald-faced hornet here, yellow jacket here. So they will predate outside the hive, and yellow jackets often will too, where they will hover outside the hive and try to predate bees as they come out or go into the hive. And then eventually, once they've done that, they'll try to go in the hive and try to invade and try to like eat the brood and stuff. I have seen a strong hive will take care of these predators, assuming they're not overwhelmed by it. I have seen a hive mess up a yellow jacket, and it was not pretty, where the guard bees just jumped on the yellow jacket and tore it apart. So as long as you have a strong hive, I don't worry too much about these, and you're not in an area with like really heavy yellow jacket or bald-faced hornet pressure. These are bald-faced hornet nests here. So again, made out of wood fiber. This is also something I've heard decoys can also be made for these that you can put up. Western yellow jacket, we have those a lot out here. They'll feed on dead bees outside the hive, so good apiary hygiene doesn't attract pests. So making sure that there's not piles of dead bees outside your hive, which obviously piles of dead bees can indicate other problems as well, but they can also invite further problems by yellow jackets. Prevention, so traps in the early spring, so like about March, you can use apple juice and water as in a 50-50 proportion as bait in any kind of a container that will allow the yellow jackets and bald-faced hornets to enter but not exit. Since they're able to fly in cooler weather than bees, if you can trap the overwintering queens, you will destroy an entire potential nest. The yellow jackets in this container were caught in a 24-hour period, so that's kind of horrifying. In early September, using apple juice and water as bait. The bottom section of the trap has cat food. So I'm just going to preface this with this is not a on-label usage, But cat food laced with fipronil is often used to treat or to trap and kill yellow jackets because they take the cat food and then they take it back to the nest, they feed it to the young, and it kills off everything. But we're technically not supposed to use fipronil that way, so that's my disclaimer. So previously recommended bait is a combination of acetic acid with isobutanol, and a few other chemical attractants. You can buy these at like Home Depot or Ace or Lowe's or whatever. But a lot of beekeepers do use the fipronil mixed into like Friskies ocean fish canned food and then allow them to take it to their nest because it is, while not technically supposed to be used that way, it is horribly effective. Northern giant hornet, we're not going to talk about it because it, as of 2024, was declared not a problem. It has been declared eradicated in Washington state. So we don't do trapping anymore, not an issue. Skunks, raccoons, and badgers can absolutely mess up a hive. To deter skunks and raccoons, keep your hive off the ground so they need to stand on their back legs to reach into the hive, or even better, if you can keep it out of their reach entirely. This also exposes their belly to bee stings, which is very vulnerable. In the case of badgers, not only use a platform to raise the hives off the ground, but also secure the hive bodies to the stands because a badger will knock off the hives. This picture on the left here is a picture of a badger attack. So using these like ratchet straps here to secure hives to your stand or platform is honestly generally just a good practice anyways, but definitely good if you do have like skunks or raccoons in your area. Bears, I have personally dealt with bears a couple times. You need at least a 7-foot tall, heavy duty electrified fence or a bear proof platform. These are bear proof. This is like a bear proof platform that's being built right here. This is a bear proof platform. It's not really economical in this area. It's way cheaper to build like what I built, which is like a little hutch with an electrified fence around it. They are actually after the larva, not the honey. So that's kind of like an old wives' tale that they're like, oh, you know, Winnie the Pooh's after the honey. They're actually after the larva because that's like a really good source of protein for them. So other wildlife and livestock, usually deer, moose, and elk, coyotes, etc., will not bother the hives on purpose. But sometimes they can wander into the apiary. So if this is an issue, just use your best judgment about locating your hives if you do live in this type of environment. Livestock doesn't purposely bother hives, but keeping the hives out of like a horse and cow pasture is a good idea. Some beekeepers do keep their bees in with their chickens, which seems to be fine and has no like issue, except for like a chicken may eat the occasional passing bee, but and like every now and then you may get a savvy hen that hangs out in front of the hive and like teaches the chicks how to gather food. But if you raise your hives, usually that's not an issue. So, pests and diseases. Prevention works better than a cure. Best management practices are more readily available than antibiotics and work better in the long term. Antibiotic use requires a veterinary feed directive or VFD, and journal or log what you see and what you do this season with which hive. This will help make decisions such as requeening later in the season or next season much easier. And also, again, like a picture is worth 1,000 words. If you see something and you suspect something, take a picture of it. Take multiple pictures of it. And of course, log it. Okay, so we are going to start on winterization. Whoops. Uh, Preparing for winter, chapter 9. So obviously, I'm going to preface this with I don't expect you to remember all this over the next 3 months. This is what the manual is for. This is what reaching out to like myself and Eli are for. But winterization is incredibly important for keeping a hive alive. Cold alone doesn't kill a hive. It usually takes a weak or small colony, a late swarm or split, robbing or predation, so like a yellow jacket or wasp or hornet. Varroa and disease is usually the most common one, specifically Varroa and Varroa vector diseases. Starvation is also sadly common. And condensation can kill a hive, but it's usually like a hive that's very poorly set up. And if you have a dead out, you need to autopsy them as soon as you can, because the longer you wait, the more moisture is going to accumulate in the hive and the more the bees are going to start molding and the harder it's going to be to figure out why your hive died. Stores guidelines. So the ideal brood and winter stores in the fall are half bees and half stores. So again, if you have 10 frame deeps, you want one box brood, one box stores of honey and pollen. If you have 8 frame deeps or 10 frame westerns, you want one box brood, one box brood and stores, so about half and half, and then one box that's just stores. And if you're using top bar, good luck to you because top bars don't tend to overwinter well, but you want 8 to 10 frames of brood and 8 to 10 frames of stores. So for a Langstroth hive, you're looking at like 100 to 120 pounds, including your woodenware. So if you have like a luggage scale or something, or you're doing like the heft test, you want like, you're aiming for the 100. I usually aim for like the 120 pounds. And keep in mind too that it will not harm your bees to leave them more food than required. So if you leave them 130 pounds, that's not going to hurt them. If anything, that'll give them a little bit of a boost in the spring. And then so that links to the first year recommendation, which is it's better to have excess stores in the spring than have a dead out. And you can always do a spring honey harvest if it's an issue. So 60 pounds pollen in stores. So you can use the heft test, you can do the scales, you can count the number of frames. Liquid first. So you want honey from a healthy hive or bank. So if you banked it in the freezer, for example, you want to feed 2 to 1 in the fall if needed, or if you're not sure that they have enough honey, or if you accidentally pulled more honey than you meant to, feed 2 to 1, which again is 2 parts sugar to 1 part water. And you want to feed that until the day temps are below 55 degrees, lower if the hives are covered. And then you switch to dry feed, which is granulated. You can use fondant, you can use sugar bricks, and then a pollen sub patty, generally one designed for the winter. If the fall is unusually warm or dry, keep feeding to prevent the bees from using up their winter stores. We've definitely seen it where it's like super sunny and warm all through like all the way to like mid-November. And if you don't keep feeding them, they will eat through their winter stores because they still need food. Some factors that beekeepers consider, more stores will be used in a warm winter than a cold. So if a snowy warm winter is predicted, then you definitely want to consider doing like the mountain camp method or something and making sure that your bees have feed over the winter. Feeding supplemental back to the bees, 50 cents for a pound of sugar versus $1.50 an ounce for honey. Obviously that price for sugar may be changing, but it's still probably going to cost less than honey. And then banked honey is the best spring feed. And then individual colonies or strains may use more broods, or may use more stores because some bees will raise more brood during the winter, and your strain changes every time your queen changes. So remember that. So your genetics, every time you requeen, unless you have an Italian, you requeen with an Italian, your genetics are going to change. And even then your genetics change even with your queen too, because your queen is only providing half the genetics. So your winterization goals are to ensure that your cluster is large enough, and the cluster is all the bees coming together around the brood to keep the brood warm. And they kind of do this thing where they vibrate to keep the brood warm. So ensure that their cluster is able to form. Langstroth enables the cluster to move upward, so that's why you put brood to the bottom and stores to the top. And the top bar cluster must travel unidirectionally, so they go from brood to brood mixed with honey to honeycomb. Make sure there's wind and rain protection, so it becomes even more important, especially with, I'm not sure how much attention you've been paying, but the last few falls here have been wild. Super windy, like violently windy, power outages, multi-day power outages, things like that, trees coming down. So make sure that your hives are protected from that wind, because if that wind's blowing through the hives, it's not going to be good for them. It's going to really impact their ability to survive. And then preventing condensation, because a wet bee is a dead bee. So preventing condensation means like lifting up the back of your hive. Some people make something that's called a condensing hive, which is where they put like styrofoam on the top, like an inch of styrofoam on the top to help it condense on the top and then slide down the sides and then slide out the front. And obviously, like I said, making sure your equipment is in good shape, and making sure that it's not damaged as you go into the winter. What are some good examples of protecting from the wind? Eli has at her apiary, she has like a lattice that like breaks the wind in front of her hives, and she's like in a fairly high, she's like 450 feet above sea level or something like that. So she has like a garden lattice that's like that's built around like a carport type structure, so that breaks the wind against her hives. Sometimes too, just having like trees in the area where the predominant wind comes from can be enough. Like that, like having a dense tree stand can work. Can you make a temporary windbreak? Absolutely. So the most common temporary windbreak is bales of hay or bales of straw. So you just build up the bales of straw in front of the hive, and that acts as a windbreak. I showed some pictures of it when we talked about hive location, but it literally is just you take whatever sides of the hive are getting battled by the wind, and you build up enough bales of hay, excuse me, to protect the hive from the wind. So at least as high as the hives themselves. So that's the best thing I've heard of for a temporary windbreak. Yeah, you could do wood panels too, as long as you have something, as long as your wood panels are sturdy and like are anchored to something so they're not going to fall on your hive. Yeah, wood panels. I've seen sandbags too used as a windbreak before. What else have I seen? I mean, I've seen people plant trees literally to create a windbreak for their hives, like planting like arborvitaes or something like that, like those fast growing like cedar, linear cedar trees. Um, but yeah, I think the most common ones I see are hay bales, which you can get from like a farm supply store or like a co-op. But yeah, wood panels would work as long as they're anchored to something so that they're stable and aren't going to topple over onto your hive, because then you just cause more problems for yourself. So cluster size, space, brood bottom, protect, no dripping, and feed. Those are your big things you want to be aware of. The cluster will contract and expand with the temperature. So the clustering starts when the bee body temperature hits 57 degrees Fahrenheit. The mantle temperature can be anywhere from 48 to 57 degrees. Their core body temperature will still be between 64 to 90 degrees. The bees only heat themselves or the cluster, not the whole hive body. So they'll heat the cluster and then whatever's in the center of the cluster, which is usually the queen and the brood. The bees in the core move around and care for the queen and the brood, and then they kind of rotate with the inner bees based on hunger, so that the outer bees are able to come in and feed, and then the inner bees move to the outside and so forth. So it follows the heat up the inside of the hive in a Langstroth because the bees kind of go up, right? One more question. A windblock needs to be a little bit higher than the entrance, right? Yes. So the windblock, what I would recommend is actually make it taller than the hives themselves if you can, but it definitely needs to be higher than at least the entrance. Especially if you have a lot of people, the reason I say taller than the hives themselves, a lot of people have upper entrances, and they forget about those upper entrances. So if you have an upper entrance, it needs to be taller than your upper entrance. If you have a lower entrance, it needs to be, and I would say a little bit more than a little higher, like probably aim for like a foot higher than your entrance, just to be safe. How far away from the hive? There's not really a standard for how far away from the hive. Like I've seen some people put it like right up against their stands, because you're not working the hives during the winter, right? Or at least not in the way that you do in the summer. So I've seen some people put their straw bales and stuff and sandbags like right up against the back of the hive to protect the hive, or like right up against the side of their hive stand. And I've also seen them put it like a couple feet away. So there's not really a golden standard. I would say just work with your space. See what works with your space. I wouldn't put it too far away, obviously, because then you can get wind that kind of goes over and goes down again. But yeah, within like a few feet of your hive should be fine. The hive temp. Oh, yeah, no problem. So they must be able to be in contact with their stores. So they need to be able to move up and down in the hive to deal with the stores and the brood. So like I saw a beginner beekeeper a couple years ago whose hive did not survive. And the reason is they did 3 boxes and they did 3 deeps. And they put their entire top deep was honey. And then they only put honey on the middle 2 frames, or the end 2 frames on the second box, and then left the inner frames empty because a very, very bad mentor had told them that the queen still needs space to lay during the winter. Which, like, yes, she kind of does, but like you're going to provide that space anyways in the bottom box. And obviously the bees are going to be hatching and be providing space. And so the problem was the bees could not get up through that empty comb to get to the stores. And the bees ended up starving to death. It was pretty sad. And obviously it's really on that bad mentor for not giving them good instructions, but they have to be able to access those stores. The hive temp does not equal the outside temperature. And the lowest survival temp depends on the number of bees, the quantity of stores, and the duration of the cold. Ensure your cluster is large enough. So we've talked about this a couple times, but merge small colonies. So if you have like a late swarm or you had to do a split or something late in the year, merge those colonies together, merge them with a bigger colony, merge two small colonies together. Make sure your colony is big enough to survive the winter. Combine healthy, weak, or queenless hives. If there are two queens, you can pinch one, or you can place one in a reserve nuke temporarily, or you can let them fight it out. That's not necessarily the best recommended method. I would usually say just pinch one of the queens, make a decision based on their laying pattern. You put newspaper between the two hive bodies, and then usually you can either punch holes in it, or you can spray it with sugar water, or you can cut little slits in it, and then the bees work their way through the newspaper as the pheromones spread between the newspaper. So it kind of melds the hive together. You put the strongest colony or the colony with the most brood on the bottom, and then after 2 weeks, shift the frame. So make sure that the brood is in the bottom and the stores are on the top. This is an example of combining colonies with newspaper. So you've got your strong colony on the bottom, you've got your weak colony, your swarm, your split, your queenless colony, whatever, on the top, and then your newspaper with slits cut in it, or spritz with sugar water, or punched holes through it, whatever. There just needs to be a way, one, for the pheromones to move through the newspaper, and two, for the bees to start tearing away at the newspaper. Because what they'll do is they'll work away at the newspaper as the pheromones spread, and as those pheromones become like copacetic with each other, and it kind of balances out the hive that way as the bees work their way through the newspaper. Oily paper towels apparently can also be used. I've only ever used newspaper. So in order to enable the cluster to form, if you're using a queen exploder, remove it. Remove excess boxes and frames, and if you are using top bar, move the follower board. And sometimes you'll ask, why are there extras? And the answer is you'll have over supering sometimes. Like why is there stuff that I need to remove before the winter? And sometimes it's because of over supering, or adding 2 frames for every frame of capped brood, or it can be because of chimneying, which is where they move directly up the center and don't expand out the sides. Empty honey supers sometimes, like that were harvested and need to be cleaned. You can have a backfilled brood nest. You can have the brood nest went down or decreased, or you can have a population decrease. So ensure you enable the cluster to move up. So again, brood to bottom, stores to top. So you want to add weight, you want to add straps, you want to have a telescoping cover, which again is that inner cover with the outer cover over the top of it. Make sure your outer cover is covered in metal. You want a moisture shim and a top vent. You want a feeder shim and candy board, or an inner cover. I highly recommend doing like a feeder shim or candy board or Vivaldi board. It's just cheap insurance, honestly. Like doing like the mountain camp method, or putting a candy board in, or putting fondant in or something. Like even if they have plenty of stores, it's just cheap insurance. Pollen sub patty, and then 2 deeps or 3 westerns, like we've discussed. The mouse guard or entrance reducer, super important going into winter. You do not want mice in your hive. And then your screened bottom board. Some people do take their screened bottom boards out in the winter. Some people put them in halfway. They take them out and replace them with a solid bottom board. But that's not necessarily strictly necessary. Protection from wind and winter. Oh, here's some pictures. So here are some pictures of the straw bales, and you see these straw bales go just about to the top of the hive. So they just stack straw bales on 2 sides. So that's like where the prevailing wind came from. And they stacked it about almost to the top of the hives. And then they've got weights on top. They probably should have ratchet strapped their hives too, but that's okay. Know where your prevailing winds are coming from versus where your hive entrance is. And if necessary, you can relocate your hives. That is an option. So if you're thinking about it and you're like, oh no, my hives are in a very windy spot, it's not too late. You can relocate. You can install windbreak. Straw bales are the most commonly used. You can put them in a carport, not enclosed. Do not close them in. That's a terrible idea. So this is actually Eli's setup right here. This is that lattice that I talked about. So she's got a lattice on 3 sides of her like little kind of carport hutch structure. And that breaks the wind for her. And then wrap and keep the entrance clear. So the wrap is like an insulation wrap. It's sold at Man Lake, Dedant, Better Bee, etc. And you can get them anywhere, but if you're using woodware, you generally want to wrap, at least in the northern climates here. If you can't lift the deeps, we've talked about this before, you can turn each deep into a western and a shim with a table saw. Condensation, avoid or absorb. So if you avoid, you raise the back of the hive 1 inch. So I've talked about putting like shims or something underneath it, or like little bits of wood or like a 2x4 or something to raise the back of the hive. You insulate under the outer cover, or you do a full wrap. Keep the entrances clear so that water can roll out of it, so the condensation can roll out the front and without harming the hive. You adjust the slide out or sticky board, and sometimes that means having it open a little bit. Sometimes that means having it completely closed. Sometimes that means completely taking it out and replacing it with a solid bottom board, and then you monitor the brood activity. Absorb is using a moisture shim, also known as a quilt box, above the dry feed and inner cover. And that's what I do. I built quilt boxes a couple years ago, and they are one of the best things I've built. Storage. So your honey goes in the freezer. Pollen frames go in the freezer. Frames with drawn comb, you can expose them to daylight, freeze and bag, or use a bug zapper around them. What I recommend is freeze and bag. They make bags like Ziploc bags that are specifically designed for honey frames. They have ones that are sized for deeps, and I think the ones that are signed for westerns as well. And obviously the shorts will fit anywhere. Bag them and then freeze them. And that will kill anything in there. It'll keep them safe in the freezer so they can't like bump into each other or bump into like your Egos or something, and burst open. And it also protects too if they do leak a little bit. You're not going to end up with frozen honey all over your freezer. As far as your equipment, so this is the time of the year to repair cracks, to scrape propolis off of it, to rotate comb, order new equipment, and also replace your old equipment. So winterization step 1, before the temps drop, you want to reduce the number of boxes. You want to do a telescoping lid with a peaked roof, not a migratory lid, which you shouldn't be using a migratory lid anyways, but telescoping lids are always preferable, at least in our area. Top insulation, liquid feeder under the top insulation, strap or a weighted lid, or both. Honey also works as insulation, but a lot of people will put additional insulation on top. And then the mouse guard and entrance reducer. And then just a note that when your hive overwinters, which obviously all our hives are going to overwinter, you reverse these stages in the spring. Step 2 is when it begins freezing at night, you raise the back of the hive 1 inch. Your mite count board gets inserted, so like your sticky board or like your gridded board. You take the liquid feed out, and then you put on your dry feed shim, your moisture or quilt box. Switch to dry feed and pollen sub. And like I said, you may think like, okay, if we've left them out of stores, why do we need to give them sugar? Why do we need to give them fondant? Why do we need to give them pollen patties? And again, my answer is just it's cheap insurance. It ensures that if you can't get to them in the spring or we have a really hard winter, that they have the stores that they need. And then make sure there's no top vent with top insulation and wrap. Or you can do a small top vent for moisture control, either one. Stage 3 is you wrap it and then move it to the smallest entrance opening. Some winterization key points. So winterization here starts in August. Pacific Northwest weather is too variable to procrastinate. I'm sure we've all lived through summers that ended really early and summers that have ended really late. And we never really know what it's going to be. Don't try to winter a weak hive. Either combine it with a strong one or let it die. Preferably combine it with a strong one or another smaller one. Condensation and starvation are more dangerous than the cold itself. Mild temps is going to equal more activity, which means the stores will get used faster. Do clear your front entrances periodically. So just pop out your entrance reducer, use like a hive tool or like a scraper or something and just scrape any dead bees and stuff out of the bottom. And then pick up or seal dead outs. You don't want to leave dead outs because yellow jackets and other predators will be attracted to them. All right, we made it through. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.